This week, we'll begin studying the life and works of Nathaniel Hawthorne, an American writer who was born in 1804 and was writing around the same time as the other authors that we've studied so far. More so than with many other writers, Hawthorne's work is influenced to a tremendous extent by where he grew up and where he lived, in New England. He was born in the seaport of Salem, Massachusetts. And the whole place, the whole region, is rich with history, with a claim to possessing some of the oldest American settlements that there are. It had been settled over 200 years earlier by the Puritans, and it was in the New England region where one might say that the American spirit, whatever that is, was born. Being so far away from Britain, the Puritan settlers had to largely govern themselves. Things were handled at a local level by local magistrates, and they were cut off from the rest of the world as they knew it. Several centuries later, during the American War for Independence, the British politician Edmund Burke would point to this moment in time and would point to the spirit of the Puritan settlers as what had truly made America unique, the fact that they had to govern themselves, and that was one of the reasons that the Americans of his day were so fiercely protective of their own independence. Nathaniel Hawthorne's ancestors had lived in this area almost from the beginning. They were a well-established family, though not particularly wealthy. His great-great-grandfather, John Hawthorne, had been a judge in the 1692 Salem witch trials, the infamous Salem witch trials. And we can talk about those for a moment because not only are they an important episode of American history, but they're also important to Hawthorne personally. So these sprang up from a general panic in Massachusetts where over 200 people were accused of consorting with the devil and practicing black magic. By the end of the trials, 19 people had been found guilty and executed by hanging. 5 others died in jail, awaiting their trials or during their trials, and several more were accused and just escaped by the skin of their teeth. Now, witch trials had not been unheard of before then. They had happened in Europe during the century before, although at this point they were kind of on the wane in Europe. The fact that it would happen in Salem was sort of surprising to people, almost like you're still having witch trials, that we moved past that 50, 70 years ago. But this was the single biggest witch trial to take place in North America at the time, and historians looking back on it today largely attribute it to mass hysteria. And I think there may have been several factors that contributed to the scope and the size of the trials. Again, keep in mind that these villagers were completely isolated from the rest of the world, the European world that they were used to, that they had grown up in. They were living in unexplored regions, beneath the eaves of dark forests where anything could be hiding, and surrounding them were Native American tribes who didn't believe in God and whose own religious practices tended to look very much, at least to the Puritans' eyes, like devil worship. So people were fearful of the unknown. They were suspicious of each other and of the rest of the world too, and this probably would lead someone to see the work of the devil or the work of demons in everyday events like a barn fire or a drought or an outbreak of disease in the village. But even while the trials were going on, there were still dissenters who thought that calmer heads needed to prevail. And it wasn't long afterward that the judges and the accusers at the trials were generally condemned for the part that they had played. It's not like everybody supported these trials as they were going on. Young Nathaniel Hawthorne was ashamed of the role that his great-great-grandfather had played in it. Interested in family history, he had dug up some old records which depicted John Hawthorne, the judge, as a harsh, stern man, and knowing that his ancestor had been a part of sentencing a fair number of people who were probably innocent to death, really had a big impact on him. I think it would have a big impact on anybody. And we'll see not only we'll see that not only in The Scarlet Letter, but in short stories like Young Goodman Brown. Hawthorne's going to be exploring the question of how an event like the Salem witch trials could have happened. He's exploring what leads people into hypocrisy and hatred toward their fellow men. His stories are centered around the theme of how guilt and sin are inherent, natural almost qualities in humanity, and that it's something that we all possess and that we all need to be cognizant of. So, his family background, as well as the background of where he grew up, had a huge impact on the literature that he would go on to write. Hawthorne would grow up to be considered something of an outsider, of an observer of social scenes rather than a participant in them. He was seen as a quiet, even almost meek guy who was well liked but always kept his distance. His father, Captain Nathaniel Hawthorne, same name, had died when he was young. He'd contracted yellow fever halfway across the world, leaving young Nathaniel, his mother, and his two sisters to take care of themselves, with the help of his mother's family. They were all kind of a close-knit group. And they were able to put him through college once he got a little bit older, where he would meet two schoolfellows who would go on to have an important impact on his life. One was Franklin Pierce, who became the 14th President of the United States in 1853. He and Hawthorne remained close throughout their lives, and Hawthorne even had the honor of writing Pierce's inauguration speech. So that's a cool fact about Nathaniel Hawthorne, how he was involved in politics. He also made friends with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, another American writer who we'll be reading in a few weeks, and we might put off a discussion about him until then. And this wouldn't be the only literary friendship that he had. Years later, he essentially became neighbors to Herman Melville, who's a familiar face or a familiar name. And they had a sort of master and apprentice type of relationship. Melville was just starting to write. Hawthorne was already established as a writer of some importance. And so Melville would often trek over to Hawthorne's house to pick his brains about writing and about other matters, and this would have been around the time that Melville was composing Moby Dick. Hawthorne wouldn't publish The Scarlet Letter until 1850, which was really the book that made his own literary career. Then, as today, The Scarlet Letter is the book that he's most well known for. But before then, he had already put out an extensive number of short stories and essays, two of which we're going to be looking at today. So, in the first of those stories, in the one titled The Birthmark, which is kind of an ambiguous title. It could be ominous or it could be benign. We don't get much about what sort of story we're going to get from the title. But in that book, we see Hawthorne's ideas about humanity and its inherent imperfections on full display. A young scientist named Aylmer wants to get rid of a birthmark on his wife's cheek that looks like a tiny red hand. It's hardly noticeable, especially when she blushes, but Aylmer becomes obsessed with it because, in his own words, it's his wife's one imperfection. Without that birthmark, he says, she would be perfect, just this ideal of beauty. Now, this is a classic tale of the danger that an overreacher brings upon himself and upon others. Through science, Aylmer is trying to one-up nature, or to do better than God himself could do. He's not content with appreciating things as they were made. He wants to better them. He almost sees it as a sort of competition. Mary Shelley's novel, Frankenstein, plays with the same theme, as does, I would say, Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. All of these ambitious scientists who bring about their own doom. Aylmer isn't quite as ambitious as those other two scientists, though. All he wants to do is remove this one little imperfection, this one little blemish from his wife's cheek. He even mentions that if she were less beautiful than what she is, the birthmark wouldn't bother him so much. It's the fact that she's, again, so close to not having any flaws at all that bothers him so much. And his obsession eventually starts to bother his wife, Georgiana, as well. She loves him, and she can't stand it when he looks on her with revulsion. So perhaps, maybe surprisingly, she's on board with this experiment to get rid of it. She's kind of offended at first. She says, well, other men have thought that it was kind of endearing. They thought it was cute, that like I had a little birthmark from a fairy handprint touching me. But she soon comes to hate it just as much as he does. Even after she learns that a lot of Aylmer's experiments have failed in the past, she still isn't deterred, and she wants him to conduct his experiments on her. Because even if the experiments kill her, she says, death is preferable to the state of existence that she lives in now, despised by her husband. So Aylmer eventually does get the birthmark removed, but the second it's gone, Georgiana dies. And listen carefully to the moral that the narrator derives from this. We read, "The fatal hand, the birthmark, had grappled with the mystery of life and was the bond by which an angelic spirit kept itself in union with a mortal frame. As the last crimson tint of the birthmark, that sole token of human imperfection, faded from her cheek, the parting breath of the now perfect woman passed into the atmosphere, and her soul, lingering a moment near her husband, took its heavenward flight. Then a hoarse, chuckling laugh was heard again. Thus ever does the gross fatality of earth exult in its invariable triumph over the immortal essence which, in this dim sphere of half-development, demands the completeness of a higher state." The idea here, which is actually a scriptural one, is that no mortal, no human, can claim to be perfect, or can attain perfection in this life. The birthmark may have been a blot or a stain, but it meant that Georgiana was only human. Take that blot away, and she ceases to be a human being. Again, this is straight out of the Bible. It's from the book of Romans. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. The idea of a flawless human being might even be considered blasphemous in this context. Just as blasphemous as Aylmer's attempts to one-up nature or to better nature. And this same theme, or the same idea, is expressed in the other story that I asked you to read, Young Goodman Brown. This story actually confronts the issue of spiritual perfection or imperfection head-on. The birthmark had resorted to using physical defection as a type of simile for spiritual defection. But young Goodman Brown just gets right to the issue. It doesn't bother with similes or metaphors. So this story is set during the time period of the Salem witch trials, and we see Goodman Brown doing something that many during those trials were actually accused of doing, and that's going out into the woods late at night to meet the devil and be initiated into a black Sabbath, or a gathering of witches. Goodman, by the way, isn't his first name. It's a title in the way that we would today say Mr. or Sir. So this is a story about Mr. Brown. And women, instead of being called Mrs. or Miss, were called Goody, as we see in the story as well. So Goodman Brown is going with the devil to a gathering of other witches deep in the woods, and he has a tormented conscience the whole time. He's worried about what his neighbors would think if they knew what he was up to. He thinks about the preacher and about the deacon, and he thinks about his wife, Faith, aptly named Faith, the narrator tells us. But when he gets to the gathering, he finds all of these individuals already there, already fully initiated. The only person who isn't beside himself is his wife, Faith. And this is where I think that Hawthorne does a really good job of capturing the suspicion and the fear of those times in his fiction. Everyone that Goodman Brown thought he knew well, everyone that he looked up to as good Christian figures in the community, are really just liars and hypocrites. Every one of them has joined the devil. At the last moment, Brown resists his initiation into the cult, and all of the figures around him immediately vanish. So, like with the legend of Sleepy Hollow, which we read last week, we're left to wonder whether or not this whole story really happened, or if it wasn't all just in Brown's imagination. There's a scene where he touches a tree that had been burning. It had been on fire a moment before, but now it's wet with dew. So was it really on fire? We don't know. Maybe it was just a dream he had. But from that night on, he becomes an unpleasant, disillusioned, bitter sort of person. He can no longer look at the preacher or the deacon, or he can't look at any of his friends without thinking about how he had seen them there in the forest that night. He can't look his own wife in the face, because he either now knows or at least suspects that every pious, godly act they do in public is a lie. Every time they sit down to dinner and his wife begins to say grace, he's got to look at her with kind of a sideways glance, thinking, do you really mean this? Are you really praying to God? Every one of them, he thinks, has secretly sold their souls to the devil. So, again, perfection is something not to be attained in this mortal life. As long as we're human, we're going to be imperfect, dysfunctional sinners. Even if we seem pious and holy outwardly, like the deacon and the preacher and the other people in Goodman Brown's village do. Perhaps this isn't the most comforting message, but it's one that Hawthorne clearly believes in strongly, and it's a theme that he's going to revisit in The Scarlet Letter, which we'll begin reading next week.